Sandra Bullock stood quietly in the first-class line at LAX, dressed in simple, comfortable clothes. She wore a plain baseball cap and had a relaxed and calm look about her. Sandra didn't try to get attention or stand out. But even though she wasn't trying to, people noticed her. In fact, a woman standing nearby was staring at Sandra with a disapproving look. This woman was dressed in expensive clothes from head to toe. Her outfit was full of designer labels and she didn't hide her feelings. The woman leaned toward her friend and whispered something. She was pointing at Sandra's casual, comfortable clothes. The woman in the fancy clothes seemed to think that Sandra wasn't dressed well enough for first class, but she couldn't have been more wrong. What happened next would surprise everyone in the first-class cabin and teach them a lesson that many would remember forever. Before we continue, we want to know where you're watching from. Feel free to leave a comment and tell us where you're tuning in from. If you enjoy heartwarming stories about famous people who stay humble, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Tomorrow we'll have another touching story that's sure to warm your heart. LAX, or Los Angeles International Airport, was buzzing with people. You could hear the rolling luggage, the sounds of people chatting, and the voices of airport workers making announcements over the loudspeakers. In the exclusive first-class lounge, Sandra Bullock sat quietly in the corner, reading a book. She was wearing black leggings, a big sweater, and comfortable running shoes, clothes that showed she valued comfort over style. She was planning for a long flight and knew that comfort was important. Her face was natural, without any makeup, showing that she didn't need to look fancy. She wasn't trying to draw attention to herself. She seemed content to just sit in the background enjoying her book. Across the room sat Helena Davenport, a woman who looked like she belonged in a movie about rich people. She was wearing fancy clothes that screamed money, and her handbag alone was so big it seemed like it had its own seat. The diamonds on her wrist sparkled with the light. Her perfectly styled hair showed that she probably spent hours in a salon to get it just right. Helena didn't look like someone who just flew first class. She looked like she owned the whole section of the plane. When Helena saw Sandra, she couldn't hide the look of disgust on her face. She leaned over to her friend, speaking just loud enough for others to hear. "Can you believe what they're letting into first class these days?" Helena said. "I remember when this lounge had standards," she added, pointing at Sandra's simple clothes. Helena's words were sharp and filled the air like perfume that was too strong to ignore. Sandra, however, was used to people making comments about her, especially because she was famous. She didn't let it bother her. Instead, she just turned another page in her book, keeping calm and unaffected by Helena's rude remarks. Helena, on the other hand, seemed determined to get more attention. Her behavior was meant to draw eyes to her, and she wasn't about to let Sandra's quiet attitude ruin that. The other passengers in the lounge couldn't help but notice the tension between the two women. Some of them stole quick glances at Sandra and Helena, wondering what would happen next. But there was one thing they didn't see. A man in a simple black jacket had just entered the lounge, and he was watching everything closely. He had kind eyes and his gaze seemed calm and kind. His quiet presence would soon change the entire atmosphere of the lounge and teach everyone a lesson about what it really means to have class. As the passengers began to board the plane, Helena made sure she was standing right behind Sandra in line. Her Louis Vuitton carry-on bag followed behind her like it was the most important thing in the world. Helena's voice, dripping with sarcasm, rang out, "How interesting," as she looked at Sandra's boarding pass. Sandra turned slightly, offering a polite smile. It was the kind of smile that had charmed millions of people around the world. But Helena was just getting started. "I remember when flying first class actually meant something," Helena continued, speaking loudly for everyone to hear. "People used to dress for the occasion." She pointed to her own expensive Chanel suit with pride, as if it were the only way to show you belonged in first class. Sandra didn't react. She adjusted her baseball cap and remained calm. She didn't get upset by Helena's comments. She simply let them go. Meanwhile, Helena was growing more and more frustrated that her words weren't having the effect she wanted. The other passengers were starting to look between the two women, sensing that something interesting was about to happen. When the boarding process continued, Sandra's seat ended up being directly across the aisle from Helena's. Sandra placed her backpack in the overhead compartment carefully, still calm and collected. Helena, however, was not ready to give up. She let out an exaggerated sigh and called to Sandra in a sweet voice that dripped with mockery, "Darling, I think you've wandered into the wrong section. Economy is further back." Some of the passengers around them shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while others tried to ignore the scene by looking at their phones or pretending to read. But it was clear that all eyes were on the two women. Sandra, as calm as ever, sat down in her seat. She pulled her book out again and began to read. Helena's attempt to get attention had clearly not worked. Helena continued, hoping to provoke Sandra into saying something. "It's just that some of us," she said, looking around with a proud smile, "work very hard to maintain certain standards. We pay extra for a premium experience." She glanced pointedly at Sandra's simple clothes, as if to say Sandra didn't belong in first class. "I suppose not everyone understands that," Helena added, her voice laced with judgment. The flight attendants began to move through the aisle with the drink service. But just as they did, the man in the black jacket who had been watching the whole situation entered the aisle. He paused for a moment, his eyes meeting Sandra's. They exchanged a warm smile, recognizing each other. Helena, still caught up in her own performance, didn't notice this quiet exchange. As the plane started to reach cruising altitude, Helena decided to turn up the volume on her act. She picked up her glass of champagne, taking a slow sip with all the elegance she could muster. Then, as if speaking to her friend Eleanor but loud enough for everyone to hear, she said, "You know, I was just telling Harrison at the country club how standards have fallen everywhere. First class used to mean something special. Now it seems like anyone can come in wearing whatever they bought at Target." Sandra placed a bookmark in her book and finally looked up at Helena. Her eyes were calm and kind, but there was a quiet strength in them. "You seem very concerned about appearances," Sandra said softly. Her voice was warm and gentle, but it carried a certain power that made Helena's sharp tone seem empty. Helena's smile faltered for a moment, but she quickly recovered, trying to act like she wasn't bothered. "Well, someone has to keep standards up," she said, raising her chin. "I worked very hard to sit in this seat and I don't want to watch it all go to waste." She trailed off, her words losing their impact as Sandra continued to sit calmly. Just then the man in the black jacket stood up. He started walking down the aisle. As he passed Sandra's seat, he paused. A few people gasped, realizing who he was. The man was none other than Keanu Reeves, one of the most famous actors in Hollywood. He had entered the cabin with the same understated elegance that he was known for, and now, he was walking straight toward Sandra. "Hey Sandy," Keanu said with a warm smile. "I thought I recognized you at the gate." Helena froze. Her face went pale as she watched Keanu lean down and give Sandra a hug. Sandra looked up at him with a big smile, replying, "Keanu, I didn't know you were on this flight." Helena's world turned upside down. She realized that the woman she had been trying to make fun of was Sandra Bullock, one of the most beloved actresses in the world. The passengers who had been quietly watching now realized the same thing. Keanu turned toward Helena with a kind, gentle smile. "I overheard you talking about standards," Keanu said, his voice calm and even. "But in my experience, true class has very little to do with what we wear or how much money we spend on tickets." Helena's mouth went dry. Her perfectly manicured hand clutched her champagne glass tightly. The realization of who she had been insulting hit her like a cold wave. I didn't mean," Helena stammered, the fake confidence she had been wearing crumbling around her. The flight attendant came over, smiling warmly. "Miss Bullock, Mr. Reeves, would you like something to drink?" she asked, calling them both by name. The acknowledgement of Sandra and Keanu's true identities seemed to echo throughout the plane. Other passengers began to whisper among themselves, shaking their heads at Helena's earlier behavior. Keanu stayed calm, his presence gentle yet firm. He turned to Helena and said, "You know, Sandy and I have been friends for many years. And one thing I've always admired about her is how she never feels the need to prove herself to anyone." Keanu looked at Helena with a kind but serious expression. "True success isn't about showing off or making others feel small. It's about lifting people up." Sandra smiled and reached out to touch Keanu's arm. "Keanu and I learned a long time ago that the way we treat people matters far more than what we wear or how much we pay for tickets," she added softly. Helena's face turned an even deeper shade of red as she realized her mistake. She had spent the entire flight trying to embarrass Sandra Bullock, only to find out that she had been sitting across from one of Hollywood's most famous stars the entire time. The rest of the flight went on quietly. Sandra and Keanu were kind to everyone. They treated everyone with the same respect, whether it was a fellow passenger asking for an autograph or a flight attendant asking for a small favor. It was clear to everyone that they didn't need to wear fancy clothes or have designer labels to show real class. As the plane began to land, Helena stood up. She was nervous now. "Miss Bullock, Mr. Reeves, I owe you an apology," she said, her voice shaking. "My behavior was unacceptable." Sandra turned to her with a soft smile. "We all make mistakes," Sandra said. "What matters is what we learn from them." Keanu nodded in agreement. "Sometimes the best lessons come from the uncomfortable moments," he said. As passengers began to leave the plane, Sandra and Keanu helped elderly passengers get their bags from the overhead compartments. They treated everyone the same, regardless of how they were dressed or where they were sitting. Helena watched in silence, realizing the lesson that had been taught. True class wasn't about expensive tickets or designer labels. It was about how you treated others no matter who was watching. After the flight, Eleanor, Helena's friend, posted something on social media. Today I learned that you can buy a first-class ticket, but you can't buy the class itself. Thanks to Sandra Bullock and Keanu Reeves, everyone on that flight would remember what true class really looked like. If you enjoyed this story, share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear what you think. Don't forget to subscribe for more amazing stories filled with adventure, mystery, and excitement. Your support means the world and it helps keep these stories coming. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.